Hey, cool kids. Welcome back to the Cool Grandpa podcast. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Ed Stevens joining us again in this powerful follow up that we're diving deep into the topic that doesn't get enough attention: men's emotional and mental health during and after pregnancy. Whether you're a dad, a grandpa, or somebody who cares about men's wellness, this is an episode you'll want to listen to all the way through. Also, be sure to share it with somebody who could really use some of the insights and wisdom that Dr. Ed Stevens shares with us around this topic of men's mental health. Now, I want to remind you as well, the best way you can help support the show is go over to cool-grandpa.us, check out the bookstore, and look for not only my children's book, but also I've got some cool polo shirts, I've got some tumblers, I've got some hats, I've got some incredible and fun merchandise over there that the grandfather in your life, or yourself if you're a granddad, are sure to enjoy. So without further ado, let's jump into this conversation. Hi, Ed. Welcome back to the Cool Grandpa podcast. I'm excited to have you back on.
Well, Greg, I'm very excited to be here.
Now, our first conversation, which we'll have a link to, we went over your background. We went over some of the work and the projects that you're in. And this time around, we wanted to talk about postpartum depression and the effects and the experience that men have with postpartum. So I wanted to start us out with talking about what postpartum is and give us a little bit of a definition.
All right. Well, I think the first thing we want to do is get rid of the Latin.
Okay.
Get rid of postpartum and say everything that has to do with pregnancy, birth, and delivery. And so the technical term is, again, postpartum, meaning a depression that occurs after delivery, but we'll use after delivery for our purposes. And these depressions and emotional upsets can start before delivery or occur during the pregnancy process. So the technical term is PPD, peripartum depression.
Okay.
When the truth of the matter is, before, during, or after pregnancy, if you have an emotional response that's troublesome, this is considered to be postpartum depression.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, and that helps out too, because I know, like you said, sometimes the depression can kick in, especially around, I think, with hormone changes. Also, I mean, just life changes coming in. So we're not just talking about after the pregnancy. We're talking about possibly during the whole pregnancy experience.
Before, during, or after. And there's something very special about men's emotional response. Very often it occurs later than the woman's. For instance, a woman may get this after birth experience or maybe during birth or process, but men very often don't get it for several months later because in some respects, the whole impact of the pregnancy, birth, and delivery, takes a little while to sink in.
No, it does. And I imagine too that sometimes with fathers and with men, you're told how wonderful all this is, and it is. But then you have the 3 a.m. feedings, you have the colicky baby, you have all of these things, and then you still have to get up and go to work. And, like you said, I think you also have the weight of the family situation and change that starts to creep in and hit maybe men a little bit later.
Yes. All right. So that's it. It's everything that has to do with pregnancy from before, from the first moment you find out, till the whole pregnancy process, and then afterwards, and for a significant amount of time afterwards. And I'd like to say this, Craig. In thinking about this, I went back a long ways, and in the early 20th century, that's the 1900s, we heard stories of fathers abandoning their families. They just disappeared. Well, I began to think about this through a modern lens and through our understanding of this depression that occurs to men. I discovered that it is more likely to occur the higher number of children they have. And it doesn't necessarily occur right after birth, but it occur years later. So that what I said to myself was, I think a lot of these men in bygone eras were getting a really bad rap when they, so to speak, abandoned their families, when the truth of the matter is they were depressed, they were overwhelmed, they didn't know how to cope, and they gave up. So this has a long tail to it. And what we're talking about is our modern understanding, but we've lived through the dark ages.
Oh, sure. And what you say makes sense in terms of there's kind of no language around this. There wasn't any support groups for a lot of things involving men's mental health. There just was no discussion. It was either suck it up and move on, or you just completely failed in some sense, meaning that you couldn't carry on with what your obligations or responsibilities and things were. And there's no sense of like, hey, Greg needs to have a break for 2 weeks to get himself together. There was none of that, to your point, especially early 20th century and backwards, for sure.
Right. All right. So we're playing a little catch up here. In particular, we're playing catch up with male mental health. Male mental health, what's that? In 2006, I went to the American Psychiatric Association before their General Assembly, 500 people, the delegates from all over the country. And I had a proposal that I put forward that the American Psychiatric Association create a committee on men's mental health. They had one on women's mental health for over a quarter of a century, very active. They gave scholarships and everything. Well, they actually passed the resolution to create this committee for men's mental health. But it was fascinating because there were naysayers there. Some people got up and they objected to this. It was going to make it all about men. Well, all right. The naysayers, after we had a voice vote that said, yes, we want this, and the chair approved it, the naysayers said, we want a show of hands. And so the delegates were asked to put up their hands. And sure enough, the support for the Committee on Men's Mental Health passed, both by a voice vote and a show of hands. However, you can't count bad things out, because what happened was it was referred to committee. In other words, it was sent to the mortuary. So it never, to this day, we do not have a committee on men's mental health at the American Psychiatric Association when there has been a committee on women's mental health for at least 50 years.
Wow.
Now, to get back to our, what we're talking about here now, this is a particular situation that has to do with, I'm going to say men's mental health again. That's kind of technical. I would prefer to say men's emotional responses to the happenings of their lives.
That makes sense, because that encompasses more when I hear that with my untrained ears, in terms of being able to express some fears, maybe some resentments, some joy, a lot of different emotions that, where I think mental health, sometimes we think about the depressions and anxieties and some of the other things with that. Emotions, to me, sounds like so much more.
It is so much more. And, I as we get into this, I can tell you in detail about my own in and around pregnancy depression, which was very significant with the birth of my first child. My first acknowledged child. I also had an unacknowledged child, and I had lots of trauma about that one too. So I can give chapter and verse on this, and everything I'm talking about, it's from my life experience that's been backed up by my professional experience. So I won't say anything here in this podcast that doesn't have personal references, and that isn't broadened and deepened then by my experience of being a psychiatrist and working with people for half a century.
So along those lines, what are some of the symptoms and some of the experiences from an emotional perspective with paternal um, post-delivery experiences?
Well, I don't want to go to post-delivery yet,
Okay.
because when we think about pregnancy, the way one finds out about it is you don't get an email. Your wife comes and says, I have something to tell you. Or your significant other comes and says, I have something to tell you. And they say, oh, yeah? Because we're not going out to dinner. This is something else. And they say, I'm pregnant. Now, at that particular moment, depending on where the individual is, if they're unmarried, unemployed, and barely connected, the news that their significant other is pregnant becomes big news, because, oh my, it's an OMG moment. So that's, one scenario in terms of the before pregnancy, just going right to the announcement. On the other hand, or at the same time, if a couple has been working on wanting to have a child for a long time, and the mother comes and says that she's pregnant, it's a matter of joy for both. Now, but you'd think a matter of joy for both would be, wonderful. Well, I must tell you that in my case, I'm speaking personally now, the matter of joy, I was 40 when my first child was the first pregnancy. Actually, we had a miscarriage before that, but I was overjoyed. I was overjoyed. As a matter of fact, I was so overjoyed, I became manic. You say, what kind of a psychiatrist are you? You unstable? Yes, I'm unstable. I think we're all unstable. In the sense that we have these, deep personal responses to things. I mean, frankly, if we don't have deep personal responses to things, we should go to a psychiatrist. So I became manic. And in my mania, I began to do things that were dangerous and out of character. Now, see, in other words, you don't necessarily have to get depressed. You can get carried away. So, and I say this at the beginning because while we're thinking about postpartum or after delivery, I said it really has to do with all the emotional responses before, during, and after. Now, just again, to get into some of the details of this, so I was elated. My wife had a completely different response. I think because of her psychological makeup and her tendency to worry, she was actually quite thrown by this. As a matter of fact, one of the books you read during this pregnancy period is Why I Hate Pregnancy. When I found her reading Why I Hate Pregnancy, I took her away for a vacation to see if a little personal time together could really help things. But, emotional response of my wife to the pregnancy was such a contrast to my own exuberance about this that I was in these cross currents. So this is all peripartum or around pregnancy emotional responses. Now, then you ask the question. Well, I can remember, and this goes directly to your question about how do men demonstrate this? How do they show that they're having these kinds of responses? Well, I can remember working harder, spending time looking at stocks and bonds, thinking about investments, making plans for the delivery. And, there's a little saying that goes, man plans and God laughs.
Yes.
Well, the pregnancy proceeded reasonably well, apart from the fact that I was a little out of my mind and my wife was a little bit out of her mind, until about 2 weeks before the due date, when my wife came down with a urinary tract infection, which is, in that situation, is very dangerous for the infant. And we all ran off to the hospital and spent a couple of days in the hospital. Well, again, this is traumatic. You're looking forward to the birth of your first child. And the next thing you know, you're in the hospital with your wife and infection. This is traumatic. Then we came home, and about 2 weeks later, she went into labor again. And this time we went to the hospital. And again, I have all kinds of stories to tell you about that. But I'll let you ask another question so that I don't monopolize your time.
Oh, sure. Well, and I appreciate you sharing this experience with us. What do you think are some of the pressures that men can sometimes face when it comes to talking about being, the extremes of that emotional roller coaster where it comes to pregnancies?
Well, I gave a lot of thought to this in response to some of your questions you put to me around the role of grandfathers. And, in reflecting on that, I thought, well, I was the firstborn in my family, and I had a very nice relationship with my father. But my father never told me a single thing about the pregnancy, the delivery, or those early years of my childhood. So there was no communication. Now, there is one little story that I have that he did tell. My birthday is March the 20th, and my mother came home from the hospital on March the 25th, and there was a big snowstorm. And my father pulled up to the hospital in his 1937 Chevrolet, and ran into the hospital to get my mother, and he locked the keys in the car with the engine running. So were there emotional responses? Well, that's the one story I have. But other than that, I have had zero communication with my father around this. And so as I thought about this today, and we're talking about cool dads, and I thought, boy, do I want to talk to my son? Do I want to share the experiences that I had in and around the pregnancy and the birth and the delivery? So that there's a certain kind of experience that comes from the parent to the child. I think that girls and women have this more with their mothers. Their mothers sometimes guide them through the pregnancy. The mothers have been pregnant, but the father really he's kind of seen as an adjunct. But as I've been narrating this to you, whoa, what kind of emotional responses does the man have? And I have much more to tell you about my emotional responses, both to the first pregnancy and the second pregnancy.
Well, and I think sometimes too, in having these discussions, and part of why I'm talking about the role of grandfathers so much is that at different times, at different life events, I think sometimes men can either feel pushed aside or really are pushed aside. Kind of like, hey, moms and grandmas and mother-in-laws and aunts and people, they've got this. And then we stand around kind of with our hands in our pockets where we want to be engaged, but then we've also been kind of excluded from it. And then everybody thinks that the man is okay. And that's not the case.
Stop right there.
Yeah.
I've never heard of a baby shower for a father. But, if you think about this, if you've had, any pregnancies in your own life, there's always a baby shower. And it's a big event. And all the women's friends gather and they bring presents and they celebrate. A baby shower. There's never been a baby shower. The father brings the mother to the baby shower and picks her up and packs the gifts into the car afterwards.
Right.
Period. So this is what you're talking about. The father is now, but I want to come back to something, Greg, because I feel there's something brilliant about what you're doing and the line of inquiry that we're following here about the role of grandfathers. And I would like to say to every grandfather that is watching this program, if you want to be a cool dad, go take your son aside and tell him what it's like. Tell him what you went through. And in this questionnaire that I created, it's 26 questions for the fathers at the beginning of the pregnancy. I intend to give it out to a group that I'm part of. It's called the Old Guard of Westchester. Everybody is at least 70 years old, and you get a yellow badge when you go past 90. There are a lot of yellow badges around too. Well, I want to give it out to every one of these men who is a grandfather. Why? Because I want them, through looking into these questions about their responses in and around pregnancy, to become aware of what actually happened to them. Most men, they just take it for granted. Nobody asks, they never tell, they don't share anything with anybody. So every grandfather that's watching, go get your sons and your daughters and tell them this is a very special time. Everybody's got a lot of feelings, and sometimes they're not always good, and the good ones we can deal with, but boy, we have to really acknowledge the difficulties, because everyone's life depends on how we manage the difficulties that arise during a pregnancy. So grandfathers, you've got a job.
Well, and I can just imagine that experience of being able to take your sons, your son-in-laws, your daughter-in-laws, all based on how healthy those relationships are, and being able to share what your experience was with maybe child number 1 through child number X, right? And being able to share both the positives and the negatives just helps lay a groundwork of, hey, there's going to be some really great emotions, and there's going to be great times with this, and then there's going to be some not so great times. Because I think if we just look at media, for the most part, we hear the stories, whether it's sitcoms or dramas or whatever. Oh, when my little girl grabbed my finger for the first time, I was hooked. This was the best thing ever. We don't hear about the fathers that really become very stressful because maybe they feel like they don't earn enough, or they've got other pressures, or they're not so certain this is the best thing that happened to them. But the messaging is, you should be happy with this. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm going to share another OMG moment with you. So I finally got my wife home from the hospital. And by the way, it was a special needs delivery because she had these kidney infections. They placed the child in a neonatal care unit, separate in an incubator, for about 5 days. My wife was upstairs. I would come to the hospital. I'd go to this isolette and feed the baby. I was feeding the baby for the first 5 days. I was giving the bottle to the baby. And finally, one of the questions in this questionnaire is, do you have a special needs child? Boy, already I had all kinds of stressors around this pregnancy. But the oh my God moment that I'd like to mention is, I get home from the hospital finally, and there's a picture of me that I have in front of the hospital where I'm holding my infant daughter. And I'm about to enter the apartment building, and I say to myself, uh-oh, what am I going to do now? Because you bring this package home from the hospital. You've never done this before. You have no idea what it's like. So that's another OMG moment. And no one asks. Everyone. There'd be all kinds of support for the mother, nursing support. Maybe a baby nurse. We had a baby nurse for the first couple of weeks after they brought the baby home. But the father was working to earn the extra money to support the baby nurse and the baby and the mother, and there was no father support mechanism, none whatsoever. So, I think in some respects, toughing it out is something we've been forced to do. And what I'm working on is trying to bring the father into some kind of integrated experience where other people know he's there. For instance, in this questionnaire, every question speaks to the father's emotional response, or you mentioned before, the father's tensions around, money, employment, God knows what. One of the questions is, do you feel you have job security? But just raising these questions and raising them in the context of the mother, So the mother gets a chance to read the questions too. It creates an enormous couple awareness of the possibilities for the emotional responses of the father. And I say emotional responses because they're up, down, and sideways.
Right, right. Are there any misconceptions, generational misconceptions or misunderstandings with grandfathers and fathers trying to relate to younger fathers today? And if so, what are some of those?
Well, I can't speak to misunderstandings. I think that it's more that I personally grew up in a tradition where I knew very little about my father's personal experience. The few things he shared with me, I've never forgotten. But I think that, this vacuum that men live in, where they are isolated from many of the family events. They go to work, they come home. They go to work, they come home. They go to work, they come home. I think that this is what has to be dealt with. And the idea that grandfathers have a chance in hearing this to make a difference, to make an enormous difference in the lives of, you mentioned son-in-laws as well as sons. But also, I think just as I've been bringing these memories up and as I've worked on these materials over the last couple of years, my life has been enriched by a deeper understanding of what I went through, the significance of it, and, how I would want it to be different or how I will do it differently with anyone who comes to me, or I if I see any man with a pregnant wife, I'm going to say, come on, I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to talk to you. You don't have to be a grandfather. You can be a friend.
Oh, for sure. And, that's one of the things I think we don't appreciate enough as men is understanding how those networks that we have change through different life events. I mean, certainly we understand that when you leave high school, for the most part, your high school friends might stay connected for a year or two, but then you drift apart. Kind of the same thing in college. But then with the birth of a child and going through that experience, if you had a network where you were doing all sorts of different activities because you didn't have young children at home, those activities and some of those networks are going to change. And so you might lose friends. And then you may also gain. But I think initially it's that your network and the people that you rely on for support are going to change, and that's going to have an effect on you as well.
Well, I think also, as we're talking about it, we have to talk about the quality of men's relationships. So many encounters with men have to do with the game on Sunday or something else. But there's very little sharing of personal experience between men. As a matter of fact, what you and I are doing here is very deeply personal. But it's a very, very unusual happening, and I personally think it's a shame, and I've tried always and everywhere in talking to men to try and deepen conversation and support them in telling their stories. I think just getting men to tell their stories is already a difficulty. Men don't want to tell their stories. They're reluctant to tell their stories. It might be that they're bragging or they're complaining. Men aren't supposed to do anything. Men aren't supposed to do anything. They're just supposed to work and keep their mouths shut.
Oh yeah, well, and part of this too is that jumps to mind is, and I think if I'm thinking about friends that are either starting families or going through some of the birth of children is, what are some of those signals that I should be picking up on? And what are some of the things that might um, lead me to ask them questions about how they're doing around the birth of this child specifically?
Well, this leads into how men show their difficulties. And men tend not to show up at a psychiatrist's office. That's number one. Or if they do show up, they don't show up depressed. They don't show up weepy creepy is the way I put it. They show up because my wife told me I needed to see someone because I've been angry lately. In other words, they show up because there's a higher level of tension in their lives. And maybe they're angry. Maybe they're drinking more. Maybe they're working more. Maybe they're isolating themselves. Maybe they're smoking more. So we have to look in different places. For instance, one of the really fascinating phenomena that I'm aware of as a psychiatrist is that women will come into the psychiatrist and say they feel anxious. You never hear that from a man. Man will come in and say, my back hurts, back pain.
Mm-hmm.
80% of presentations to physicians are back pain in men. And the truth of the matter is, as a psychiatrist, I'll say I never saw a back pain that didn't start with some kind of stressor. So we have to think differently about men.
Sure. Well, and to your point, I think it's keeping that eye out for what's different in their habits. And, if you have friends that are starting to go through some of these things, where, to your point, are they drinking an extra beer when you go out? Are they seeming to be a little bit more edgy or angry?
Yes.
And then to your point, are they seeming to be way more happy than what they normally are when they bounce to the other end of the spectrum?
That's right. So, but when men go out in and around the pregnancy, one usually congratulates the other. Whereas, that's an aspect of it. But I don't even know what role congratulations has in a pregnancy. It's I would think it might be more. All right, now listen. I'm not going to congratulate you. I'm just going to say I'm going to welcome you into the brotherhood or the fatherhood or the in other words. So let's get down to it. I mean, what congratulations, as if a man did something by getting his wife pregnant. Big deal. Come on.
And I would suspect, if I had to put my historian cap back on, is that some of that comes around with increasing the workforce on the family farm, or getting an heir, or some of these things that hundreds and even thousands of years ago were really important and had much more of that I don't know, that economic part of having children that came into play back then. But that's a guess.
Well, here in reflecting on this, I think it's just the absence of a sense that fathers have whole lives, and part of that wholeness is a very rich emotional experience. When I was thinking about this prior to coming on, I thought to myself, all those months and years anticipating the pregnancy, during the pregnancy, in the early years with my child, then my children, I had an interior life, but I had no one to share that interior life with. When a mother sticks the baby in the stroller and goes for the to the child care center, she talks to other mothers. I remember I dedicated one day a week to taking my daughter to some of these child care activities. I'd load her in the stroller, I'd bring her there, I'd show up. I'd be the only man that would show up at Dilla Quayle Music School with my 2-year-old. And I really wanted to talk to the mothers. They didn't want to talk to me. I mean, I was like a strange dude. And I mean, they didn't know what to make of me. They didn't know whether I was there to seduce them. They didn't know where I was. They thought there was maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe it was, you know what I mean? So in other words, even as I interjected myself into the in-depth circumstances of bringing up the child, participating in, I got no buy-in from the other stakeholders. And you never see the men because the men are always working. So I think that one of the things that I think is really crucial is to acknowledge the loneliness of being a man. There's a deep loneliness in it because, as you put it, we're excluded from a lot of the major life events, not intentionally, just, so to speak, casually and routinely. And then if the men do get together, they don't get together to chat about the children. They get together to smoke a cigar. They get together to have a drink. They get together to talk about the local sports team or whatnot. So there's a kind of an emotional vacuum that men live in that's really, really difficult. So, and to all the grandfathers that are out there, if they can remember this and they think about their own lives and think about the emotional vacuums that they grew up with, they should rush out and try and talk to another man, even if it's to talk to another grandfather. Even as a result of this conversation, it said another guy, what was it like for you when your wife was pregnant? I can't wait to give this questionnaire, Bringing the Fathers into Pregnancy, to this old guard network where everybody's from 70 to 90. And I want to see what they have to say as to how it jogs their understanding of where they were in ways that they never imagined.
Oh, yeah. Well, and some of what you're talking about there also, it jumps to mind too about, some of the experiences that happen when, and we talked a little bit about it, like a special needs delivery, or when there's issues with that child. And I sometimes think that there's more support that comes alongside the mom than maybe the dad. I mean, the dad, it typically will be like, here's what's wrong. There's a hole in the heart or a club foot or whatever it is. And we've got surgeries and we've got all this. And so it seems like it piles on even more when we have some of these other circumstances. And I think that's a big red flag for a lot of us to be looking for with our friends, with our sons, and being able to even try to be even more intentional to have those heart-to-heart discussions, because something that may have been already an emotional hardship that they had to navigate and try to go through is now you've got another layer to that afterwards that was information you didn't have before.
I'll give you an example of this. There are a lot of miscarriages, and it's felt to be a deep trauma for the mother, which it is, and the mother will get lots of support and sympathy. But I'm going to tell you, only within the last 6 months has it come to my attention that every unplanned termination of pregnancy, every miscarriage, is as much a trauma for the man as for the woman. There's no grief counseling for the man. There's no grief counseling for the father. I'm telling you, there's just an absence of acknowledgement that the father is very much part of these events and is affected by them. I can remember I said I had a miscarriage. I had a miscarriage. So that's an interesting way of putting it. My wife had a miscarriage. No, I had a miscarriage before our first child. What a disappointment that was. Okay, she had a miscarriage, and everyone was, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Nobody ever said so sorry to me. I had a miscarriage too. Or you mentioned hole in the heart, you mentioned the birth defect, but I would like to tell you that after a divorce, when I lost my children in the skirmish, and my daughter never spoke to me again. It's over 30 years now. I haven't seen my daughter. She was 16 at the time. I describe myself as being a member of the Hole in the Heart Club. In other words, I had a hole in my heart. And I think that I'm not the only member of the Hole in the Heart Club. Men experiencing trauma that is unacknowledged. Only they know what's going on.
So a question I've got for you along these lines is, in your opinion, are therapists prepared if the younger generation of fathers that would step into an office and say, hey, I've experienced this miscarriage, or I'm struggling with understanding what my role is with this pregnancy, and here's some stress. I might be uncertain at work. Do you think that enough therapists are equipped to work and help coach young men through this?
Well, I'd like to start at the beginning of your question where you said, if a man were to step into a therapist's office, I think the likelihood of that is practically zero. Then you went ahead with the description of one of the really important things today. 80% of therapists are women. And by and large, women don't know anything about men. They're unsympathetic to men, especially the latest cohort of women who have been schooled in feminism, where men have been thought to be the enemy. So, the possibility of a man presenting is very low, and the possibility of a man getting some kind of empathic response from a therapist is quite low too. And many years ago, when I was working with two male social workers, I wanted to create an entity called National Association for Male Social Workers, NAMS. There is National Association of Social Workers, but I wanted the National Association of Male Social Workers because we need more men in the helping professions, more men available to work with and to talk to men. Because, I'm sharing with you my personal experiences. If a man came into me, I'd be able to talk to the person because I have really absolutely in-depth personal experiences. But if a man who has experienced a miscarriage goes into a therapist, be they male or female, the likelihood of getting an empathic response is very, very low. So this is important. In other words, when I talked earlier about creating a committee for men's mental health, I was really saying I was trying to raise awareness in the psychotherapeutic community about the need to address men's mental health or men's emotional responses.
Well, and I like what you have to say along those lines is I feel like sometimes, from what I've heard, a lot of the therapist offices themselves are set up very much to support female patients in terms of just the general setup, right? And I've always had this idea, and you tell me what you think, that a good male therapist is going to have a project car that's out in the parking lot that the two people work on and talk while they're going back and forth, just based on guys like to be doing something while we're talking and sharing.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on something that's very important, and that is men learn and share in different ways. They might share while working on the project car, so it's very hard for a man to come in and sit down. I'm going to say it's unnatural.
No, I agree. And, like I said, I always thought, well, and even where I've gone in and seen things in schools too, going, a little off topic, but a lot of the classroom setup is not really, I think, set up for little boys to be little boys and even adolescent boys in a classroom setup, that there's something missing in some of those cases.
Let me pick up on this theme now, because I have run men's groups, and when men get together and they are directed or encouraged or supported to share, they do, and they share in-depth experiences, and they share their emotional life if they're supported. And also, I think, in my experience, it's been easier for men to share in a therapy group. Again, many years ago, I was interested in consciousness raising, because basically the women's movement grew out of consciousness raising groups. It became every place you went, there was a consciousness raising group for women. Well, I put a protocol together to create consciousness raising groups for men, because I feel that would be very important. I mean, frankly, anyone that's listening to this podcast, if they go and they get 3 or 4 other guys who want to take their own lives a little seriously and somehow share and support each other, they should sit down with each other without the beer and without the sandwiches. Just sit down and say, well, let's share our life experiences with each other. So I think men do share under certain circumstances. I think you pointed out men learn differently, but men are capable of this and doing it very deeply and very sincerely. And men are capable of supporting one another, and I think even eager to support one another. But what you're doing with these podcasts is you're saying, whoever is listening, take a leadership position. Go get a few other people. Go, any other grandfathers? Go get a couple of grandfathers. Talk this over. Create a grandfather's network.
Oh, for sure. I think that's one of the big struggles with most men, is at a certain point in our lives, and a lot of times it's younger, our networks just continue to shrink as we get older because of just different life factors, but we still need those networks. They just become less and less, numbers wise, as we get older. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. That's such an important point, because after we get married, our friend base shrinks, because the wife says, "You're going out with those guys again? You only get into trouble when you go out with them." Whereas the women tend to, by virtue of being married, their networks increase. So what you're pointing out is very important, and I think men really have to be careful to try and work against that shrinking network of intimates.
What I think too is that as we get older, and it might be a discussion for another time because I'd like to continue this, but the idea of, I think sometimes we have to relearn how to have intimate conversations with friends and even with families, because I think sometimes as we get older, we become more protective of what we share and how we share it, versus when we're younger. And I'm thinking back to high school years, right? Is we're talking about, who are you asking out on a date, and who's the pretty girl, and what are you doing this weekend? And you're talking about so much, as well as struggles at home, that as we get older, we stop sharing some of this information for a variety of different reasons. But I think we lose how to have intimate conversations with other men and with friends as we get older.
Well, I think it may be more difficult rather than we lose the ability. I think we never developed the ability because our friend circles diminished. Now, there's another problem that you bring up. One of my favorite lines is, most people my age are dead. I'm 88. I don't have any friends from way back. Why? They're all dead. as a matter of fact, I say, befriending me is almost a kiss of death. So you got to be careful. So, um, you know, there are all kinds of factors involved in this situation of isolation for men. And I, at this particular point, am working on that isolation. For instance, in this podcast, I'm working on the isolation because I'm saying, I don't know who's going to listen to this. I don't know if we'll ever hear any feedback from it, but I really want to pass on what I know. So in other words, I'm making contact with others through this podcast, and it feels good to me because one of the aspects for me as an older man was I felt that I had learned a lot in life, and I wasn't going to be stingy about it. I'm absolutely willing to share anything and everything I have with others, and I have grandchildren, and I talk to my grandson, and the things I said to my grandson have all to do with my life experience. In other words, how I discovered how to get along, how to advance oneself. So I try to share. So although perhaps the number of contacts coming back to me are limited, I think that my capacity for outreach is good. I mean, I give talks at the Ethical Culture Society. I've joined this old guard, whatever, and I do it for the companionship, but also in some respects as a continuation of what I was schooled to do as a man, which was basically to give, to be in the service of others. And I think that what we've been talking about here is everyone that's listening would be a help if they reflected on doing for others as simply a part of life. Having others do for them is another part of life. And having others do for you or share with you does not make you less than. So I think that men, in terms of their idea of needing to be sufficient, are always concerned about being less than. Well, I find that giving and sharing of emotional experience, rather than make me less than, creates a richness. I feel good after these podcasts.
Oh,
Yeah. I feel I've perhaps touched some people, passed some information along.
absolutely. Well, and Ed, I've had you on for a little bit. Is there anything about men's mental health and men's experience with pre and during and post delivery that you'd like to talk about that I haven't brought up?
I think the most important thing is for there to be an awareness, not just in the man, but in the partner and in the family and in the professional community, that the man has emotional experiences and responses. And this is called epigenetics, technical word. It just means we bring our experience to whatever we do, wherever we are. So another one of the questions in that I put together was, have you had any recent or past traumatic experiences? Now, traumatic experience is not built into the genes of the father. At the same time, it affects how the father responds. With the birth of my first child, there was a lot of trauma involved, in the sense that it was a cesarean section. And because my wife had had an infection, they were worried that the child might have a meningitis and become disabled. So I actually talked my way into the delivery room. And when the baby was delivered, it was put in my arms. And then we went off to the side because a resident was supposed to take a spinal tap on the baby. Well, the baby is there, and I was with the resident. And I was holding the baby like this while the resident put the needle into the back of the kid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he did it once, he did it twice, and he didn't get the spinal fluid, so I said, stop. I said, I'd rather have it be brain dead than paraplegic. Now, I go back to my professional life, and I find that when parents come into me as a psychiatrist, and they say, I have a sick child, I have this or that difficulty, I said, I really can't talk about this. It brings up too many feelings. So I had a post-traumatic stress experience in response to the peripartum, the around birth and delivery experiences. So, and that's what we call epigenetic. In other words, the things, for instance, if you've grown up in a happy home, that's an epigenetic experience. You carry that with you. You're looking forward to creating a happy home. If you grew up in a troubled home, you may be looking forward to family life as traumatic, epigenetic. In other words, being aware that men not just carry the genetic load of their entire ancestry, but also the emotional and I would say feeling experience of their lives. They bring this. And they bring it into the pregnancy, they bring it into the delivery, they bring it into the family life. And then what happens during labor and delivery is also brought forward because I just said for several years after the delivery, I said, I can't talk about that. Brought up too many feelings.
Mm. Mm. Well, I appreciate you sharing those experiences with us. I think it just helps drive home the need for having understanding and thinking through this and not pushing fathers and men aside during some of these life events that come up. Ed, where can people find you? Where can they find out more about the work that you're doing?
Well, I have the Foundation for Male Studies. M-A-L-E, not M-A-I-L. Whenever I type it into Google, it always comes out M-A-I-L. So, no, it's male. Foundation for Male Studies. And if they go to malestudies.org, they can see the foundation and I have a number of short videos of pertinent topics. And also, I tried to create an in-depth library of books that would help men to understand themselves, understand their lives, understand their difficulties. So the Foundation for Male Studies, malestudies.org, is it's a resource. And it's actually, the work I've done around bringing fathers into pregnancy, I've done it all under the banner of the foundation. In other words, this is not Edward M. Stevens, doing this work. The Foundation for Male Studies is taking a deep interest in everything male, and that includes a man's experience as a pregnant father. Now, I love that word, pregnant father, pregnant father, pregnant father. What, are you kidding me? Well, anyone who's had a child knows exactly what I'm talking about. Because as soon as your wife becomes pregnant, you start holding her hand when you cross the street.
Mm-hmm.
You start carrying packages and opening doors. The pregnant father. So the pregnant father is just living pregnancy in a different form. The pregnant father stays awake at night worrying about job security.
And we'll be sure to put the links to everything that you've mentioned into the show notes, as well as the links for our first conversation will be there too, where we go into your background and we do more of a deep dive on that as we set up this topic in this conversation. So, Ed, I want to thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. I really have enjoyed our conversation and our time together, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Well, I'm looking forward to it too, because I think after every one of these conversations, I become a cooler grandfather.
Absolutely.
A more knowledgeable grandfather, and a grandfather who's got, what do I say, grandfather power.
Yes. Yeah.
In other words, boy, we have a role to play. Come on, this is grandpa power.
that's the goal, is similar to what you're doing, is let's wave the flag around and let's talk about the important role that grandfathers can play, and get people off the sidelines and into the game.
Yes.
So, well, thanks again, and look forward to our next conversation.
All right, now you just sign me up.
Will do.
I'll be there.